Today I want to share with you an all-purpose seasoning recipe for making a nutrient-dense house seasoning mix that not only brings flavor to your food, it also brings added nutrition. Hi sweet friends, I'm Mary and welcome to Mary's Nest, where I teach traditional cooking skills for making nutrient-dense foods like bone broth, ferment, sourdough, and more. So if you enjoy learning about those things, consider subscribing to my channel and don't forget to click on the little notification bell below. That'll let you know every time I upload a new video. Well, I think you're going to really like this all-purpose seasoning recipe because if you're looking for ways to add nutrition to your food, this mix takes everything to a new level. Now we'll go over all the ingredients that you're going to need, but don't worry, you don't need to write anything down. If you open up the description under this video, there'll be a link, it'll say recipe. If you click on that, it'll take you over to my website, same name as my YouTube channel, Mary's Nest, and you can read the recipe online or you can print it out. And in order to open the description under this video, it really depends what device you're working on. You may see the word show more, or you'll simply see a little down arrow to the left of the title. And if you click on either of those, it'll open up the description for you. Now this recipe is based on the original recipe that was developed by a gal named Lori, and she called it her SOS herb mix. And Lori, you may be familiar with, is the founder of the Foodwifery program, which has since morphed into what's known as the Healing Table program. And I'll be sure to link to Lori's website below so you can see the various nutrient-dense recipes she shares and whatnot. Now this recipe has a lot of options available to you based on what tastes you're looking for. However, there really are three, maybe I'll say four, key ingredients for making this a nutrient-dense seasoning mix. And the first three key ingredients are salt, and you're going to want sea salt. Now I like to use the fine ground Celtic gray sea salt for this recipe, but I know many of you have told me you like different types of salt. So yes, you can use the pink Himalayan salt, or you can use the other salt that's mined here in the United States called real salt. Any of those will work, but what does work best is that you use the fine ground version. And you're going to want 1 cup of fine ground sea salt. And the reason that you want to use sea salt as opposed to a more commercial salt that has been more highly processed and often contains various chemicals and anti-caking agents and so on and so forth is because sea salt is very rich in minerals. And often our diets can be very limited in minerals. So using sea salt helps add in minerals that are much needed by our bodies. The next two ingredients are the real powerhouse ingredients. The first is nutritional yeast, and the second is kelp powder. Now for the nutritional yeast, you're going to want 1/4 cup, and for the kelp powder, you're going to want 2 teaspoons. Nutritional yeast is so rich in B vitamins, and B vitamins are wonderful for nourishing our nervous systems. Very important in the hectic world we live in today, but I think that you will be very pleased with this because nutritional yeast also adds a very delightful flavor. It's almost a little cheese-like. And as I said, all you're going to need is 1/4 cup because nutritional yeast goes a long way. A little bit really gives you a good punch of B vitamins. And what you want to keep in mind is you want to look for nutritional yeast. You're not looking for the type of yeast that you use when you bake bread, baker's yeast. That's something different. So you want to look for nutritional yeast. Now, kelp powder is very rich in iodine, and that's very nourishing for our thyroids. But you don't need a lot. Just like with the nutritional yeast, the kelp powder really provides a very high nutritional punch. So all you need is the 2 teaspoons. And that spread over all of the salt and the herbs and whatnot is going to give the nutrition you need without an overwhelming kelp flavor. It does sort of have that seaweed or taste of the sea, but it really becomes somewhat indistinguishable when we talk about all the other flavorings and seasonings and spices that we're going to be adding that really give this such a wonderful flavor that you almost don't notice that there's the kelp powder in there. It's a good way to disguise it. So just to get these out of the way, I'm going to go ahead and dump my sea salt in here. I'm going to go ahead and dump my nutritional yeast and now my kelp powder. And now we're going to talk about these other herbs and spices that we're going to be adding to our mixture. Now the next ingredient that you're going to want is dried parsley. Now if you grow your own parsley and you grow Italian flat leaf parsley, which is what I like, and you dry it, that's perfect for adding to this. Otherwise, if you buy dried parsley, that's fine. You know, sometimes it's the curly leaf parsley that's been dried. Both are fine to use. It doesn't make a huge difference. I just like the flavor a little bit better of the Italian leaf parsley, but that's not always easy to find. So I want you to know that you can definitely use anything that's just labeled parsley that you buy dried at the grocery store. Now, regardless of what type of parsley you use, dried parsley doesn't have a really strong flavor, but it helps bring some bulk to this mix and to also almost serve the purpose of a distributing agent. It helps distribute all of these flavors along with the salt and along with these other herbs and flavorings that we're going to be adding, and distribute them evenly throughout the seasoning mix. So I highly recommend that you do use the parsley, and you're just going to need a half a cup dried. Now the original recipe calls for various amounts of certain herbs and spices, and I don't add all of them in, and I'll share with you as we go through this list as to why I don't add those in. But there are ones that you may want to consider, so I am going to cover them even though I'm leaving them out. The original recipe calls for a teaspoon of marjoram and a teaspoon of celery seed, but I leave both of those out. Number one, I find that the celery seed does impart a relatively strong celery flavor to this seasoning mix, and my husband's not a fan of celery flavoring, so I leave it out. But if you like the flavor of celery seed, by all means go ahead and add it in, and know that you are going to get that celery seed flavor coming through. The original recipe also calls for a teaspoon of marjoram, but I leave that out because I am adding in oregano, which is also called for in the original recipe. And marjoram is basically, to me, sort of a mild flavored oregano, and so I don't feel it really brings anything to the table, so to speak. The other flavors somewhat overpower it, and I really don't taste any marjoram coming through, and I just don't feel it adds anything additional to the flavoring or to the recipe mix, so the seasoning mix. So I leave it out, but if you really like marjoram, you can go ahead and add it in. If you find oregano too strong, you could even omit the oregano and just go ahead and use marjoram in its place. Also, in the original recipe, the amount for the chives is 1 teaspoon. But I have found that 2 teaspoons of chives work better because the chives are rather, you know, kind of bulk or bulky, I should say, in nature. And a teaspoon of chives isn't really equivalent to a teaspoon of these other ground herbs. And so I find that the flavor of the chives gets lost. And I like chives very much, so I go ahead and add in 2 teaspoons, and I find at 2 teaspoons, you do get a little bit of the chive flavor coming through. So what I've got here on my platter is a teaspoon of dried oregano, a teaspoon of dried basil, a teaspoon of dried thyme, a teaspoon of dried dill, a teaspoon of dried sage, and also 2 teaspoons of the dried chives. So I'm just going to go ahead and add all of this into our mix. Next, we're going to be adding in onion powder and garlic powder. And I have adjusted these amounts from the original recipe because I found that there was a little too much garlic flavor for our liking, because it can really overtake this seasoning blend. And I would rather add more garlic to whatever I'm cooking at the time of cooking to make this more of a truly all-purpose seasoning. So the original recipe does call for 1 teaspoon of garlic powder, but I have decreased that down to a half a teaspoon. Now, if you really like garlic, and which I do, but I find that for an all-purpose seasoning, the half teaspoon works well. But if you really like garlic and adding it to everything that you make, and you want a stronger garlic flavor coming through your all-seasoning mix, then by all means you can pop this up to a teaspoon. But I'm just going to add in a half a teaspoon. And I've also found the same to be true for the onion powder. Now, the original recipe calls for 2 teaspoons of onion powder. I've decreased it down to 1 teaspoon, a little more than the garlic powder, because I find that the onion powder really is very all-purpose, but I don't want it to steal the show, so to speak, from all the other flavorings in here, which are really quite delightful. So I'm just going to add in a teaspoon, and it really works very well. You know, just like if you were making a mirepoix where you were putting, you know, the French term for the basic mix that chefs will use, that is carrot and onion and celery, and how onion really often is a base for a lot of seasonings and can add a nice, almost a little bit of sweetness to whatever it is that you're making. That's how I feel about the onion powder, and that's why I go ahead and add in a full teaspoon, but not the 2 teaspoons, which then starts for me to become somewhat of an onion seasoning. This way you have the nice undertone of the onion flavor, but it doesn't take over. Now all you need to do is just use a whisk or wooden spoon, whatever you have, and give this a real good mix to make sure that all of the herbs and the onion powder, the garlic powder, the salt, that everything is very well incorporated. Once you get this all mixed up well, you're just going to go ahead and decant it in a jar. You're going to keep this by your stove, and whenever you want to add some seasoning to whatever you're making, you've got this handy. You can start with a half a teaspoon, work up to a teaspoon, whatever you think will be appropriate to whatever it is you're making. But this is, as Lori called it, her SOS seasoning, which I thought was very cute. It saves the day. But now, if you'd like to learn how to make more seasoning mixes, be sure to click on this video over here, where I show you how to make 10 homemade seasoning mixes, plus how to make homemade salad dressings, homemade mayonnaise, all sorts of homemade things for your pantry. And I'll see you over there in my Texas Hill Country Kitchen. Love and God bless.